Hello and welcome back to another episode of Joe's Art History Podcast, a podcast which celebrates all things art historical. With me, your resident host and art historian, Joe McLaughlin. And today I'm back bringing you the fourth instalment of Art of the Deal, a series where I take a deep dive into some of art history's greatest art dealers to discuss what made them so special and how they have influenced how the art world works and operates today. Now this is part 4 of the series, which I'm hoping to make a 6-parter. So if you haven't listened to parts 1 through 3, you can find that earlier on in season 1 of the podcast, where I look at Paul Durand-Ruel, who was the Impressionist, very important dealer, the king and ultimate art dealer himself, Sir Joseph Devine, and the icon that is Peggy Guggenheim, who is more often remembered as an art collector rather than an art dealer, but she was a very, very important and influential art dealer, particularly for the abstract expressionists and bringing them over to Europe. So it's part 4, and who might I be speaking about, you're wondering? Today I'm going to be introducing you to Leo Castelli, who was an absolute titan within the New York art scene. Castelli was an absolute powerhouse and trendsetter in the 50s, 60s and 70s New York art scene. But what's particularly interesting about his life and his work as a dealer, he didn't actually start dealing until his late 40s, early 50s. So he's a great example of someone who's come back to the art world, or who's started a career in the art world later in life. Although, as you'll see, he's always sort of dabbled in and out. I've loved researching Leo Castelli. This is a really great series, and I'm delighted to bring you part 4. So just sit back and relax as I bring you Art of the Deal, part 4. So the first obvious question is, who was Leo Castelli? Leo Castelli was an Italian art dealer who made his name in the 1950s, 60s and 70s in New York. He represented some of the world's greatest artists and is known for catapulting the likes of Jasper and Robert Rauschenberg into superstardom. Born into a relatively wealthy family in Italy, Castelli did not start dealing in art until later in life. He actually began his career as an insurance broker, and when he got a little bit bored of that, changed and worked as a banker in Paris, where kind of the art world and the art scene in Paris first caught his eye. However, it wasn't until he moved to New York to escape the Nazi occupation of France in 1941 that really he came into his own on the art scene. Now, it didn't happen straight away. Castelli spent about 10 years managing a factory when he first moved to New York in 1941, after also serving with the American troops in World War II, right at the end of World War II. And you'll be amazed to hear that he didn't actually open his first gallery until the age of 50, and introduced the art world and to the likes of then unknown artist Jasper, which not only catapulted Jasper into ultimate art world success, but it helped cement Castelli's name within the art world as a trendsetter and force to be reckoned with as a dealer. So I think a really good question is to look at, did Castelli have any connections in the art world? It's very interesting that he started as an insurance broker and then banking, and so what happened? How did he get into the art world? So he didn't actually have any art world connections, but he did always have an interest in art. And he even dated the surrealist painter Leona Fini, who also was born in the same Italian village that Castelli came from. And it wasn't until he moved to Paris and was a banker that art started to pique his interest. He was a friend of a furniture maker and dealer and acquired a shop in Paris through moving in artistic circles, and began showing works of surrealist artists such as Max Ernst and, of course, his girlfriend Leona Fini. It's also important to note that he was mentored a lot within the art world as well, and I think this is something, particularly as I'm having my art world journey, I'm seeing a lot of very good people. A lot of the top people seem to have mentors or have turned to art world professionals who have 40, 50 years experience and use them as mentors. So it's an interesting theme. That's something that still happens, and I'm sure it's not just the art world that has mentors. There's mentors in every line of work that you go into, I suppose. But it wasn't until he moved to New York that he had his most important mentor, who was a gallerist called Sidney Janis. Castelli helped Janis when he moved to New York to organise exhibitions and out with his day job managing this factory that he was in. And eventually he moved away from Janis and started dealing full time. So where did he operate? Well, as I said previously, it was largely in New York, but Castelli was a charismatic character and an excellent networker. And this is skills that he honed working in insurance and banking. So it really helped him step up a level, and networking is such an important thing to do, particularly within the art world. It really is all about who you know, leaving an impression, and yeah, people buy from people, and I think Castelli understood that very, very quickly. But after leaving his job in banking, he used his connections gained through his old job to find buyers and get the word out about his Paris gallery, which I've previously said that he opened with his friend who was a furniture maker. And how the shop operated was there was some furniture at the front, and at the back of the shop they had artworks. And as the success of that shop grew and grew and grew, it essentially became completely overrun by paintings. And they did all right. But in 1939, war was once again on the horizon, and Castelli and his first wife, should I say, closed the gallery in Paris. In 1940, Leo could see how things were going, and his position as a Jew in Europe was very dangerous. So he and his wife decided to flee Paris, and they did this literally 2 or 3 weeks before the Nazis invaded. France fell to the Nazis, or Paris fell to the Nazis. In 1941, via a rather long route to get there, due to war restrictions and things like that, Castelli arrived in New York, where he would eventually open up his gallery and leave a lasting impact on the art world. After serving in the US Army, which Castelli signed up to do near enough the second he touched base on American soil, and this was a scheme that the American government that were running, that if you were an asylum seeker or you had come from Europe and were looking for refuge in America, if you signed up to serve in the US Army, that upon completing your service, you would get a US citizenship. So he did this in order to gain a citizenship for himself and his wife. So essentially he served in the war for a couple of years, and when he signed up, he essentially was sent straight back to Europe. He never fought, but he went and did administration, communications and things like that. So he didn't see battle, but still very important ins and outs of working in the War Office for the United States. Eventually, when he came back, he was granted a US citizenship, and he took a job working in his father-in-law's knitting factory, of all things. And he's, as I said previously, he spent 10 years working there and skipped out more and more and more to visit museums, galleries, visit artists, go to private view openings, and really started to very slowly emerge himself in the New York art scene. And he established a gallery in the early 1950s in New York. And from that point, he never looked back, nor did the art world. So my next question, what group of artists did he promote? So Castelli's career saw him working with an unbelievable amount of big names, from Andy Warhol to Max Ernst, and Salvador Dali to Jackson Pollock. So yeah, he knew the big dogs. He was at the right place at the right time. He is best known, however, for being the dealer to, and I say air quotes here, discover Jasper Johns and push him from little known obscurity into immense collectible / megastar artist status, which even in those days was very rare and something that didn't really happen in your lifetime. But all eyes were on New York, and at this point in the 50s and 60s, New York was really carving itself out as the place to be for art. There was a lot of money, a lot of wealth in America, and just a lot of really interesting things happening in New York. And Castelli could see that, he could feel it, and he just jumped on it. So, as I said, Castelli, right place, right time, and he worked with some incredible artists. So in no particular order, I'm just going to read a couple of the people, or artists rather, that he used to show in his gallery and that he worked with and helped catapult into fame. Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, Robert Morris, Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner, Cy Twombly, Bruce Newman, Dan Flavin, who I absolutely love. If you've never heard of Dan Flavin, he is a light and installation artist, just gorgeous. Max Ernst, Dorothea Tanning, and the list continues. But you get the idea. This man was a tastemaker. He could spot talent at 10 paces. Castelli is quoted in saying he never worked with an artist merely because they were good. For Castelli, good was not enough. They needed to be about to kickstart something massive that Castelli, if he walked into the studio, could sense he was on the cusp, or this artist rather, was on the cusp of something incredible. They needed to be ahead of the pack, or even better, starting a new movement altogether. And that's exactly what happened with Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg. So you're probably wondering, okay, great, he worked with some brilliant artists, kind of right place, right time in New York. What did he do that was so influential? Castelli was fearless in his representation and did many things which other dealers thought twice about doing, such as showing Andy Warhol's now iconic soup can paintings for the first time. So no other gallery in New York wanted to show them, and Castelli thought, what the hell, let's do it, I think they're great. And quite arguably, probably one of the things that Warhol is now probably best known for, bar his sort of pop repetition pattern of Madonna or the Queen that you see reproduced in postcards and bags and all sorts of things. But yes, his iconic Campbell's soup can paintings. It was Castelli that was the first dealer to show these in New York. So he took risks, but most importantly, he believed in his artists with absolutely everything he had. With every ounce of himself, he believed the gallery was a crucial meeting point of minds, trends, and tastemakers. He helped direct an artist's profile and genuinely had a massive impact within the history of art. Castelli was one of these incredible dealers who didn't just think about now, but really thought about an artist's profile, about protecting an artist's name, monitoring an artist's name, and helping direct the market very slowly to ensure that there wasn't a humongous rise and then a sudden crash in wants. For Castelli, he was one of the first dealers that really nurtured relationships and an artist profile with a collector's base and the wider art scene in general. He didn't think about just now, he thought about 50 years time, 100 years time, what would people be saying about his artists? And he really made sure that he set the pace of how people found, represented and bought his artists. For Castelli, he forged the first kind of lifelong reputations with artists as well, seeing their relationship as something which needed to be worked on both sides. Watching an interview with Castelli, which I'll link in the show notes below, it's really interesting. I think it's always great to hear people talk about their work, about what they do, and hear their own voice, particularly art dealers. It's not very often that you have recordings of them, particularly sort of this early on. But there's a recording with Leo Castelli. This is 1979. And Castelli told the reporter, when he was asked about his career as a dealer, quoted as saying, "The function of an art dealer, well, it can be various. Certainly a good art dealer, one who cares about making art and not making money. It should be to find new artists, make them known to the public before museums can do it. They function in a much more cumbersome way. They have to figure out schedules well ahead of time. We are the real vanguard," he continued. We're really the lead. We, the good dealers, can just make things happen so much more rapidly than if we had only had to rely on museums. Then museums, well, sometimes rapidly, sometimes more slowly, judge what you're doing and go from there. So he really understood and was one of the first dealers to really speak openly about how important a gallery was at trend setting, at taste making, and building up an artist's reputation. And one of the best things, or one of the most iconic things that Leo Castelli ever brought into play within the art world is what's known today as the Leo Castelli Method. So what is the Leo Castelli Method? This was a method which today probably doesn't sound too radical, but at the time it was. He devised a new model for how to treat his gallery roster, and by roster I mean his group of artists. And one that was so influential, it's called the Leo Castelli model. Under the, air quotes here, old system, galleries simply sold artworks and split the sales profits between the artists. It was merely a transactional relationship. They didn't assume the artist would have lifelong loyalty to the gallery or the dealer, and it was all very, a bit cold, very sort of business heady, weren't really thinking about the future at all. But under the Leo Castelli method, the gallery and the artists have a bond, with the dealer providing the artists with money for a studio and art making supplies, and tracked his market to make sure prices didn't get too inflated, which is something that galleries do today. If you're a good gallery and you represent an artist and another gallery comes to you and says, oh, we would like to consign some works from XYZ artist, it's the gallery who represents that sets the prices. Now, this might not seem like a big deal, but it's a really important tool which regulates an artist's prices and helps allow them to increase slowly, and allows you to justify why something 10 years ago cost £1,000 but now costs 25,000, which is a humongous increase and rarely happens unless you're like Tracy Emin or Damien Hirst or something. So yeah, it was Castelli was the one that tracked the market value when he was consigning works out to other galleries of his artists to make sure that the prices didn't get too inflated. And there's some galleries, particularly in London, that you wouldn't really touch with a barge pole, that tend to buy artists' works outright. And then because they own it, it's their stock, they set their own prices, and it tends to be £20,000, £30,000, £40,000 over and above what a gallery that's representing it will. So it's quite an important thing to have a representation, or to have somebody controlling your prices and thinking of a long game instead of just a short-term profit. The gallery also carefully nurtures the brand of the artist, which is something, again, was very innovative. Castelli handled the press, public relations, and made sure that they were regularly slotted into his exhibition schedule. So it wasn't like they had one show and then they were never shown again, or that they had one show and then the next one would be 5 years' time. He was regularly making sure that there were solo shows and group exhibitions and that all his artists were included. This is also a really important marketing technique when you work in the art world, because it shows people that when they buy an artist, even if it's in a group exhibition in the gallery that you bought it in, that the gallery and the market value the artist and the artist's work enough that it continues to be shown throughout the year. So it's a really, really important marketing technique. One practice of Castelli's was not adopted by many of his followers, though, was his insistence in giving each artist a stipend every month, regardless of whether their work was hot at the moment or not. They were regularly making artwork or not. So what this means is every month Castelli paid his artists a little bit of money just to make sure things like materials and studio costs were covered, regardless if they had sold or not. This technique is more of investing in the artist and kind of being a patron almost. Instead of saying, oh, you have to make X amount of works for me, he was just making sure that his artists knew that they meant more to him than just making him money. Like, he genuinely cared about his artists and wanted them to live a life where they could thrive and create and not have to worry about certain things, which might sound, everyone should be doing it, but it's amazing, and just shows how much he really cared about his artists and what he did as well, most importantly. Castelli, if you ever hear him talk about working in the art world, he's so knowledgeable, he's so passionate, and he just loves it. He's one of these people that, when for researching for this podcast, when I watched and listened to him speak, when you watch somebody who's just unbelievably clever and good at what they do, it was so envious to see how knowledgeable he was, and every ounce of him loved what he does. And I would definitely say go check out the video that I was talking about earlier in the podcast, where he's interviewed for a New York TV series. I think it's called Art Today or Art Now or something, that used to be on the television in the 70s. But it's really brilliant, and like I said previously, it's just great to hear these people speak, Castelli speak. He's also got a really good interview where it's him and Jasper Johns as well speaking, and it's really funny because Jasper Johns is like, they're discussing the first time that Castelli found him at an exhibition that he'd gone to, and then Robert Rauschenberg, who Castelli was representing, helped track I say helped track Jasper Johns down. They were living in the same building together, and Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg were also in a relationship together at the time, which is not well known now, but at the time really wasn't spoken about. Anyway, bit of a tangent there. But yeah, so he would give his artists a stipend. So that was the Castelli method. He gave them a stipend. He made sure that he handled press and public relationships for his artists. He made sure that they were regularly slotted into exhibition schedules. He made sure his prices didn't get too inflated. And he made sure that there was a real deep bond between gallery and artist. There was a friendship there. It wasn't a transactional relationship. It was something much deeper, which might seem like nothing new now, but this was streaks and streaks ahead of what other galleries in New York were doing at the time. And through doing this, he helped curate collectors' tastes while making sure his artists' reputations were intact. That's the most important thing. And this was particularly important when artists began to skyrocket into fame, like Jasper Johns and Roy Lichtenstein. Castelli really held the reins of who could get access to the work, how their prices were set, and made sure that there was a slow increase instead of an absolute rocket increase in prices, which is really important. So how did he find his artists? How did he meet all these people? What did he do? So Castelli was forever on the hunt for the best new artists in town and used his network of artists and thinkers to point him in the right direction of interesting people. So he got out there, he spoke to people, he went to studio open days, he went to private views and galleries, spoke to people and said, who's interesting, who have you come across, etc., etc. And interestingly enough, he really wasn't afraid to, if he found an artist, for example, to approach dealers and say, I'll split representation of that artist with you. And there's a great story where he'd come across an artist in New York that a younger dealer had spotted before Castelli, and went to this young dealer who was, I think, about 25 at the time, and he said, okay, I'll split the representation with you, and if you let me do this, I'll share all my contacts with you. I really want a cut of this pie because I can see this guy is going to be amazing. And what that dealer got in return as well as an amazing contact book, which obviously you wouldn't be able to do today through lots of different laws and information sharing acts and laws and things like that. The young dealer also was then sort of cemented as somebody to be respected in terms of taste because Leo Castelli had come on board and had semi-representing this artist alongside him. So Castelli was a big name. He had a lot of sway, a lot of power, and people respected him. Another interesting thing about Castelli was that he was open to artist pitches, and so was always happy to hear artists that came to him to show them their work, to hear what they were doing. And even if Castelli couldn't represent them, or even if he didn't want to represent them, he was more than happy to point people in the direction of other dealers and galleries whom he felt might benefit from showing their work. Listening, you might not think, right, okay, whatever, so he sent them off in the direction of somebody else. I mean, I've worked in the art world for 10, 11, 12 years. Nobody does this. They just say, no, you're not for us. No, sorry. Nobody really takes the time to say, why don't you try this place? Why don't you go? I think they'll be interested in seeing this. And more importantly, he used to say to the artist, tell them I sent you, and they'll look at your portfolio, which I think is really important. So that, for me, speaks a lot about Castelli's character and his love of art, and that it really wasn't always about making money, but just helping artists realise their full potential, even when they weren't under his representation. So that, for me, really helps Castelli stand out as not only probably one of the nicest people within the history of the art market, but I think also a genuine dealer who just loves what he does and was more than happy to give you some of his time. On top of that, Castelli was very passionate in advocating and communicating his thoughts for what galleries should and shouldn't do, and he condemned galleries that tried to steer the direction of artists to fuel sales, stating that he believed a gallery's involvement with an artist should be, and I quote here, almost totally passive. The artist should in no way be influenced by the gallery. I let my artists do as they want. Sometimes I don't agree what they have done, but the artist is not to be disturbed above all. Which, again, I really respect. I love that idea that he wasn't all about making money. And this might sound strange, but as I've said previously, I work in the art world, and there's a lot of artists that a gallery will go to them and say, oh, that print sold really well, let's make the same print, but let's make it blue, and we'll sell 50 more, and then we'll do one in green, and then we'll do one in pink. And they're all about making money. And I was listening to a podcast about a year ago now, and it might have been Richard Long I was listening to speak on this art podcast, and he was saying whenever he has an artist, or he hears an artist that calls it their party piece, an artist that's really known for something, like if you think of Damien Hirst, you'll think he's really known for his spots, or Tracy Emin, she's really known for her neon works. But that's not the only thing that they do, but they might create those things because they sell really well, and it's their bread and butter. It allows them to be artistically free in other areas. But yeah, Castelli wasn't interested in party piece artists or directing his artist's creativity in any way, which I really applaud. Something I couldn't find in my research is if he ever worked with British artists. I know he did use his connections in Europe to champion and show American artists in Europe. So Castelli, his first wife and him, actually, they separated, hence first wife, separated, and she went back to France after the war was over, and she married a French photographer, and they set up a gallery in Paris. And I think it had it was in Paris and a few other places, but Castelli and his first wife were still on really good terms, and Castelli used that connection to bring work of Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, Roy Lichtenstein, Andy Warhol, and bring that over into Europe for people to connect with the American market. So he was really clever. He could always see an opportunity to sell and promote his artists. So he was really, really clever. I don't know if he had any connections in Britain, or if he worked with British artists, or even if he showed any of his artists in British institutions while he was representing them. If I find anything, perhaps I'll give you an update, but for the moment, I can't find anything that suggests that he did. But he did work with people in Europe. That's how he got a lot of his artists shown in Europe and bought in Europe as well. So throughout my Art of the Deal series, I've always discussed what each dealer has done to shape the art world or affect the art world that we know today. So for Castelli, he did the Castelli Method, as I've previously said, but there's something about that doesn't quite sit right with me, particularly the stipend. When I was reading a lot of things, it was saying that he was one of the first dealers to give his artists stipends, and that's not, I wouldn't say that's exactly true, because in Art of the Deal Part 1, where I discussed Paul Durand-Ruel, he kind of came up with the concept first, and he was the Impressionist dealer in France. And Durand-Ruel was, funnily enough, the reason that they sold really well in America. But Paul Durand-Ruel, when he had money, used it to give his artists stipends. So I would kind of argue that wasn't the first, but I applaud him doing it anyway. He's done a lot of things, though, that has impacted the art world. So the first thing that he's done that has affected how the art world works today was he was a mentor. Apart from making sure that the world would never forget the likes of Roy Lichtenstein, Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, which by all means is an achievement enough for most people in their lifetime, he also mentored a selection of the next generation of dealers. There's a great photo that I'll include in the highlights reel on my Instagram page where it's Castelli on a boat, it looks like, with his then mentees, and his mentees are Larry Gagosian and Charles Saatchi, who have gone on to form two of the greatest art galleries and collections of modern and contemporary art within modern history. So Larry Gagosian, if you've never heard of him, that is the gentleman that is behind Gagosian Gallery, and Charles Saatchi, who made his money in marketing, founded the Saatchi Gallery, which is in Chelsea in London, and it's a free gallery which shows his private collection. And yeah, really, really interesting. So two big names within the art world that Castelli mentored. And funnily enough, Castelli also helped a young Larry Gagosian secure his first stable of artists to represent, and helped him acquire an exhibition space and put him in touch with some of his top clients to get him started. So talk about a leg up and then some. So he was very generous in sharing his connections, his network, and helping the next generation of dealers. Something else that Castelli did, which affected the art world, he was a photography enthusiast. Now, photography, if you've listened to my previous episode on Is Photography an Art Form, photography has until quite recently, been overlooked within the history of art, and it was very similar to when Castelli was operating in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And Castelli championed photography as a respected art form, and when the art world was all too keen to dismiss it as a hobby, Castelli bought and set up an additional gallery space in New York, which championed and exhibited photography as a worthy art form and something which should be respected, collected and loved. And this gallery was run by his second wife, who loved photography. And it was really successful. And he worked with a lot of interesting photographers, artists that use photography. But I'm not going to go into that too much. I'm just going to keep going about Castelli. But if you want to read a bit more about that, there's links in the show notes below. Another thing, as I've touched on previously, he uses connections in Europe. So much like Peggy Guggenheim, Castelli used his connections to stage shows of American abstract expressionists and pop artists like Warhol or Lichtenstein outside of the States. And as I said as well, he even worked with his first wife and her new French husband to show his artists in their gallery in Paris. So, is the Castelli Gallery still around today? Yeah, it is actually. Although Leo Castelli sadly passed away in 1999, his gallery is still run out of New York. It's now changed names. Instead of being the Leo Castelli Gallery, it's now just Castelli Gallery. The gallery still champions the works of the modernist artists such as Jasper Johns and Roy Lichtenstein, who he showed throughout his lifetime. And I'm sure he still represents the work of Jasper John as well, which is incredible if he does. So I've just given you a very brief whistle-stop tour of the life of Leo Castelli and why I believe that he rightfully holds one of my coveted top 6 spots for being one of the world's all-time best art dealers in my series Art of the Deal. And there you have it, another episode of the Jo's Art History podcast. Once again, thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed round 4 of Art of the Deal. This was a very, very brief sort of whistle-stop tour of Castelli. He was in operation at such an interesting time in the art world, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. There was so much happening, so much going on, so many big switches between abstract expressionism, pop, minimalism. Just everybody and anybody seemed to have been shown in his gallery, and I would really suggest that you have a look and just check out how much of a powerhouse Castelli was. There's a whole host of links in the show notes below, so I would say please check that out. And if you want to read a little bit more about Castelli, I've got a blog article which went up on www.josarthistory.com back in December 2021, so you can read a little bit about it. And if you can't find links in the show notes, the links are also in that blog article as well. I came across Castelli through a great book called The Rogues Gallery by a gentleman called Philip Hook. And what Philip does in his book is detail essentially, I think, 15 great art dealers or people that were influential in changing the art world and how we know it today. So there's a great chapter on Castelli's life in there as well. If you've enjoyed this episode and can think of someone that would also benefit from listening, please feel free to pass on the podcast. It would be great to get more people listening. Any images that we discussed today can be found on my Instagram highlights reel at Jo's Art History. That's my Instagram handle. And if you want to get in touch, my DMs on Instagram are always open, or you can email me, josarthistory@gmail.com. Finally, I've been Jo McLaughlin, your friendly host and art historian, and thank you so much for listening. And I look forward to welcoming you next time on the Jo's Art History podcast. Until then, keep learning and remember, art is for all. Bye!